spring of 1811. Men with pry bars lift worm soft planks in a shuttered tobacco warehouse by the James, and the air blooms with dust, sweet rot, and something colder. Beneath the floor, 8 small wooden coffins hand-planed, identical as if cut from one thought. Inside each, a man's wedding ring and a thimble, glass vial of whitish powder sealed with black pitch. Different names scratched by penknife, different dates, one rhythm. Every ring once clasped the finger of a husband of Ruth Holloway, the widow Richmond called a saint of sorrow. She outlived 8 men. The vials explain how. The magistrate who first saw the boxes ordered silence, citing delicate reputations. He feared scandal more than sin. For 2 centuries the rumor stayed pressed beneath ledgers and polite lies. You are here because doors like that never hold. Tonight we open it and count to 8. I will guide you through marriages built like rituals, through medicine that soothed in drops and impersonated providence by the spoonful, through a city that preferred elegance to truth. But you are not a spectator. If you dare let your mask slip, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments to seal this truth within you. Tell me where you're listening from, Lahore, Lisbon, Memphis, Moulton, so I can map the living chorus waking to buried history. And subscribe, because this descent is a staircase and I intend to take you to the bottom. Ruth's story does not begin with a teacup. It begins with a country sewing itself with dirty thread. 1780s Virginia glittered river mansions, brass buckles, candlelight. Underneath, confiscated estates, quiet bribery, and men who learned loyalty rented by the week. Into that masquerade stepped a widow with winter, fog eyes, a Latin tongue, and a leather book of cures. They said she healed. She did. They said she had the touch. She did. But talent is the instrument, intention writes the song. What Richmond named piety was purpose. What it called coincidence was design. 8 husbands, 8 funerals, 8 vials sleeping in the dark. Listen with old ears and you'll hear gossip. Listen with the ears I'm giving you and you'll hear a ledger balancing in blood. Autumn 1782. Richmond draws breath after war, smoke still braided through its chimneys. A striking widow arrives from the north with a trunk, a journal, and a reputation made of silk and restraint. She speaks like a woman tutored by cold libraries, reads Latin without blinking, and knows the country herbs the way a locksmith knows teeth of a key. She rents a modest house on Clay Street, then turns it into a threshold. Sick children stop coughing, tremors quiet, sleep returns to rooms where it had been banished. The gentry, freshly rich on seized loyalist parcels, invite her to parlours to recount Yorktown grief in a register both modest and immaculate. She is useful to women who ache and men who posture, and usefulness is the purest coin in a rebuilding world. What they praise as remedy is also reconnaissance. Ruth listens better than she speaks. She notes the names that carry rooms, the men who drink too quickly when a certain British colonel is mentioned, the laughter that goes brittle when supply wagons, mislaid during the war, become a topic. Richmond's surface shines with victory, its undercurrent moves with purchased silence. There is talk, never in court, always in corners, of a quiet fraternity formed during the worst months, a handful of merchants and officials who learned how to turn defeat into invoice, ferrying information to redcoats for boxes of bright coin. No proof touches sunlight, but Ruth reads what isn't written. The leather journal she carries is not a family Bible. It is a ledger of plants and behaviors. Foxglove measured in grains. Laurel leaves that mimic fever. A handful of bitter kernels whose scent suggests almonds and graves. She catalogues what calms in crumbs and what kills in teaspoons, what can be folded into possets and cordials, what can be explained by the climate and the meat. The first suitor, Colonel Edmund Fairfax, tobacco prince and quiet tyrant, courts her with the gravity of a banker counting land. He believes he is acquiring price, not peril. They wed with music and pewter clatter. By midsummer he complains of a stomach that gnaws. Servants whisper through door seams. Lightning builds somewhere no one can see. Ruth writes nothing in her public hand, but in the private margin the ink grows darker. A note, a dose, a date, August 1783. Night drapes the study in brandy fumes and candle glow. The house servant, Jupiter, sold and resoled like a chair, hears a chair scrape and a low animal sound. He edges to the window. Colonel Fairfax is folded over the desk, hands clamped to his middle, breath snagging. Beside him stands Ruth with the face of a mother at a cradle and the posture of a magistrate at judgment. "Drink," she murmurs, holding a steaming cup whose scent is honeyed until the last. "Where something almond and iron waits, it will ease." He drinks because men like him trust remedies when prepared by soft hands, and because pain makes the proud obedient. The moaning fattens, one convulsion then another. The inkwell topples. Papers skate the floor. Ruth watches without flinching, then moves with exactitude, basin ready, cup rinsed, cloth folded, voice lifted into theater. "Help, help." Neighbors run, servants quake, and the physician Harrison arrives at the floating edge of dawn, hat askew. The story told to him is the story everyone prefers. A robust man fretted by business, taken off by gastric fever, common to sultry months, likely meat turned or water filed. His hands find no bruise, no rope, no blade. He writes the certificate that gives the city permission to forget. Soil covers a coffin, sympathy covers a fortune. But a truth begins moving under the floorboards. Ruth learned the shapes of death, not from a grandmother's garden, but from a man Philadelphia expelled. A doctor who tested plant spirits on the edge of law and decency. He taught her how to cure to be believed and how to kill to be forgiven. She refined the math. A little alleviates. A little more imitates Providence. The widow's journal is not a book of prayers but of ratios. After the funeral, society carries her like porcelain, careful, admiring. Fairfax's will redrafted with rings still shining, hands her house, coin, land. Grief makes her fashionable. Fashion makes her untouchable. Jupiter tells what he saw to those who will never be allowed to testify. Rumor becomes a key without a door. Ruth buys fabric, smiles in pews, walks the river paths alone, and returns with baskets of leaves that look harmless because they are green. January 1784. The new husband is a seaman, Captain William Randolph, praised for threading winter storms with a spine like iron bar. He marries Ruth because sorrow flatters his courage and her composure flatters his vanity. 8 months later his gut burns like banked coal. Old Caesar, the household's elder, mops the corridors and memorizes what dignified eyes refuse to see. The cup Ruth will not surrender to other hands, the locked chest with apothecary vials, the way her grief when displayed. After the captain dies, diagnosis, again, a climate word and a fever word. Caesar finds a loose board in the study wall, and behind it a small glass phial dusted white and breathing that faint almond breath. He shows Jupiter at the market, 2 enslaved men carving truth from whispers. They understand the scent the way sailors understand a sky. They also understand the law will never hear them, so they keep a ledger of their own, a spoken archive that travels kitchen to kitchen, field to field. Medicine becomes myth, becomes warning. Richmond's parlors, meanwhile, compete to host the widow who suffers beautifully. Wealth accrues like frost. The more she has, the more everyone agrees she deserves it. The ritual clarifies. An illness described as stomach, a night of ministrations, a dawn of condolences, a tidy certificate, a deeper purse, a louder pity. Still with me? Good. Because this is where you must choose what kind of listener you are. If you feel the hinge turning inside your chest, type, "The veil is broken," twice in the comments and lock that decision. It is not a slogan, it is a map that brings you back when the next lie tries to lead you away. This is not about one woman and her cups. It is about a city that loved its reflection more than its dead. The third suitor arrives robed in law's Judge Thomas Henley, delegate and drafter, a man who believes constitutions absolve their authors. He speaks of order, Ruth hears opportunity. They marry under chandeliers. In her journal the ink tightens. Dosage, timing, witnesses, alibi, a tonic that soothes digestion in drops and imitates God in a draught. January 1786. 12 guests toast the judge in a dining room freckled with candlelight. Henley is genial, steady, ribbing his friends about constitutional hairs they've split. After the roast and the syllabub, Ruth brings a glass just for him, amber, aromatic and heirloom, digestive, from her mother's table. He raises it with the little flourish of men confident in their bodies. Minutes later, sweat beads his lip. One hand to the belly. A pause that makes the room's laughter falter. Ruth is solicitous, efficient, not alone. Witnesses garland her with innocence. A chair scrapes. The judge sags. The physician is fetched. Harrison, for the 3rd time, stands over a man whose stomach has turned to a locked door. Suspicion brushes him like a moth's wing, then flits away because suspicion without method is gossip, and gossip against a widow with a perfect face is treason against good taste. He signs again. Acute gastric distress. The funeral preens. Ruth faints at the perfect moment and is steadied by hands eager to be photographed by memory. Wealth compounds, pity matures to protection. Marriages 4 through 6 unfold with metronome discipline. George Carrington in 1787, dyspepsia. Merchant Samuel Bradford in 1788, nervous fever. Banker Edward Custis in 1789, gastric apoplexy, a phrase that sounds learned and explains nothing. Each death is a coin dropped into the same well. Each cup rinsed in a prepared basin. Each certificate a door swung shut. Yet patterns speak to those trained to hear them. Among the enslaved, an invisible college compares notes. Ruth never lets a servant measure her remedies. Her walks carry her into oak shade and laurel thickets. She returns with baskets and a gaze that never apologizes. And then a disgraced Philadelphia physician, Marcus Wainwright, takes a small house near town's edge. He keeps few patients and fewer friends. Caesar sees Ruth visit him at dusk, leave after dark. The city calls it mercy. She visits the fallen the way saints visit lepers. The ledger under the ledger writes it differently. Wainwright's hands once distilled plant ghosts into tinctures that could masquerade as providence. Ruth doesn't need his morality. She needs his mathematics. He arrives thinking knowledge makes him king. He has misread the board. Late 1789. Wainwright has learned her true name like a secret verse. He knows she did not wander into Richmond by chance. He knows the first husband she ever mourned, Captain Jonathan Holloway, did not die at Yorktown's cannon smoke as her story claims, but in the slow kill arithmetic of betrayal march orders leaked to redcoats by a tiny domestic cabal, a convoy ambushed at dusk, a body left anonymous among spent cartridges. He also knows who paid for it. He wants a dividend. Their arrangement is simple and poisonous. He refines methods. She pays percentages. He suggests expansion, other cities, other marks, a traveling enterprise of remedy. He mistakes her discipline for greed. Ruth's ledger is not a purse. It is a balance sheet of names, men who sold a country in rooms that smelled of ink and beef fat. Fairfax, treasure of the Brotherhood, is chalked off. Randolph the ship king, chalked off. Henley the lawmaker, chalked off. Carrington Bradford Custis, chalked off. 2 remain: Harrison, physician who greased official diagnosis, and the most luminous prize, the politician who arranged the whole clockwork from colonial office to post-war parlor, Governor Edmund Randolph. To touch him is to touch the city's self-regard. It will require a mask she has not yet worn. Meanwhile, Wainwright grows noisier. He writes notes instead of speaking softly. He drinks, he hints, he threatens to publish. Ruth smiles as if gratified by his daring. She files each threat under loose ends. In the kitchens, Jupiter and Caesar refine their counter-archive. They cannot indict. They can remember. Their recollection is a country the law cannot occupy. Far to the north, another mind begins triangulating. Captain Jonathan Hale, late of Continental Intelligence, files closed cases that refuse to close. He tracks whispers of a Richmond circle that bartered secrets for British guineas, then notices with professional interest how many of those names have recently died of the stomach. He is the kind of man who hears a metronome behind rain. He packs his papers and heads south, officially to settle property disputes, unofficially to follow a chain of illnesses that rhymes too neatly to be natural. Richmond will soon discover what happens when a ritual meets a reader of patterns. Hale arrives with manners burnished and questions wrapped in cotton. He plays visitor, not hunter, and studies the city the way a locksmith studies a door hinges, scratches fresh varnish over old gouges. He befriends Harrison. Doctors trust men who flatter their Latin, and coaxes him into inventorying the surge of gastric deaths among the eminent. Over wine, Harrison's unease blooms. He admits nothing actionable, only a tremor under the voice when the widow's name appears in conversation. Hale walks Clay Street at twilight and watches Ruth's windows hold lamplight like a theater. He sees the apothecary chest carried by no servant. He finds the old captain's study and the panel that hides a hollow where a vial once lived. He visits Wainwright's cottage pretending he needs a tonic for sleep. The disgraced physician tries to sell brilliance seasoned with bile. Hale hears leverage panting behind every sentence. He buys a small bottle, not to drink, to learn. He meets Caesar in the market and lets silence expand until truth steps into it. The enslaved man, weighed down by knowledge that cannot buy him anything, shares the almond reek, the rinsed cups, the perfect grief. Hale collects testimony the courts will not receive and binds it with other evidence the city refuses to smell. He studies Prussian treatises on prussic acid, the chemist's new word for an old invisible scythe. Almond on breath, bluing to lips, collapse like a trapdoor. Signatures no coroner here has vocabulary to name. He notes that the widow's remedies, praised for swiftness, travel the same path. He writes the names of 8 men and draws a line to a single woman the city calls unlucky, devout, touched by misfortune like a saint by stigmata. He does not believe in saints, he believes in systems, and he sees one. He sketches a trap with patience. Wainwright, leaky by nature, becomes the hinge. If Hale can make him talk into the right ear, the chorus of coincidence may falter. But traps require time, and Ruth Holloway has killed enough to sense the animal smell of pursuit. She changes the tempo, new suitor, chosen not for money but proximity to power, a bridge to rooms where governors drink their nightcaps. The 7th husband is a banker of temperate habits and immoderate confidence. He imagines marrying Ruth will launder his soul. She imagines his dinner table will place her one handshake from the governor's glass. The city approves. Tragedy packaged as resilience sells beautifully. Hale, meanwhile, cultivates Wainwright with flattery, brandy, and the counterfeit comfort of being understood. The old experimenter loosens. He brags about ratios and mixtures, the art of dosing to mimic fevers common to Virginia's damp heat. He mentions a leather journal, a hand more elegant than his, and a method more patient. He wants coin enough to flee. He does not understand that the only currency he owns is his breath. The banker's decline begins in late autumns. A flux, a bilious visitation, the same theatre, new audience. Ruth times the draughts between visits from note-takers and toasters. Harrison watches as if his eyes could earn absolution. He cannot prove what he suspects, he can only drown in it. Hale judges the moment ripe and prompts Wainwright to commit his knowledge to paper for posterity. The man obliges, writing himself into a confession framed as a treatise. Ruth, who reads the currents under the floorboards, pays her colleague a final courtesy. She arrives with a cordial, the kind Wainwright recommends to patients he cannot cure. He drinks because wolves do not expect teeth from their pack. By morning his heart is still. His cottage yields papers and bottles, some empty, one labeled with a careful hand that is not his. Hale pockets enough to reassemble the song. You are not a spectator. If your pulse has taken on a second beat, the cadence of patterns revealing themselves type, the veil is broken, twice in the comments and anchor that recognition. Rituals bind. Ours binds us to noticing. The governor's winter reception is announced, a smaller room, fewer eyes, heavier names. Ruth's invitation arrives on cream that smells of money. Hale's plan at last steps into the light. He will not let the 8th ring be buried with a certificate and a compliment. He will force Richmond to see what it has trained itself to unsee. But the truth has a strange way of surfacing, sometimes not through evidence, but through whispers, inconsistencies, and the slip of a tongue. And Ruth Holloway, she was never as careful as she thought. When you bury 8 husbands, each under a different excuse, heart failure, poisoning disguised as stomach illness, accidents that made no sense, the cracks begin to show. A neighbor recalled something chilling the night before her 4th husband's death. Ruth had laughed over dinner, raising her glass and saying, "Men are never as strong as they think they are." At the time, it sounded like a harmless quip. After his sudden collapse the next morning, it became a line burned into memory. Then came the insurance papers. Ruth always moved quickly, filing claims, collecting payouts, wearing widow's black with practiced tears. But one clerk noticed something off. The handwriting on her husband's alleged signature didn't quite match. The strokes were heavier, rushed, like someone trying to mimic what they had only briefly studied. That clerk filed the observation away, but never forgot it. And Ruth's past, well, she worked hard to erase it, but fragments of her trail remained. In one town, whispers followed her, a husband who drowned despite being an expert swimmer. A funeral where Ruth didn't shed a single tear, but asked the undertaker if she could have the insurance forms ready as soon as possible. In another city, An old doctor swore she pressured him to sign off on a death certificate before the autopsy results were back. No one pushed too hard at the time. She had that disarming smile, that ability to appear as nothing more than a grieving wife. But those fragments lingered. The most damning, however, came from her own slip. In the late night haze of her 8th husband's funeral wake, a friend claimed Ruth muttered something strange. She raised her glass of brandy and whispered, not to anyone, not even to herself, but into the silence of the room, 8 down. I suppose that's enough. The friend told herself it was drunken nonsense, nothing more. But years later, when the whispers of the killer widow began circling, that sentence came roaring back like a curse. Ruth believed she was untouchable, that she could keep slipping from husband to husband, grave to grave, fortune to fortune. But what she never understood was this: secrets aren't buried forever. They fester. They leak. And when they do, they drag everything down into the light. And so we arrive at the end of Ruth Holloway's trail, a path paved with wedding vows and headstones, sealed coffins and insurance checks. For years she walked through fire untouched, her hands clean in the eyes of the law, her mourning veils convincing enough to blind the world. But history does not remember her as a grieving widow. It remembers her as something darker, an apex predator disguised in lace and silk, hiding her venom behind the gentle touch of a wife. By the time whispers of her deeds began to form into legend, it was too late for justice. There was never a trial, never a jury, never the clang of iron bars. Ruth slipped quietly into old age, her crimes unpunished, her neighbors never knowing the full scale of what lurked behind her smile. Yet her story lived on in rumor, in hushed warnings, in the nickname that clung to her like a shadow, the killer widow. 8 men entered her life, believing they had found love, companionship, security. 8 men were buried before their time, their bodies carrying secrets that could never speak. Ruth understood something few dared to admit: murder doesn't always require blood on your hands. Sometimes it is as subtle as a tincture slipped into tea, as silent as a signature forged on a document, as invisible as the look in her eyes when she watched another coffin lowered into the earth. The true horror of Ruth Holloway's tale is not just the deaths. It is the silence around them. No one stopped her. No one connected the dots in time. It was the perfect storm of complacency, charm, and greed, and she exploited it all. That is why her name drifts through true crime lore even today, not as a case closed, but as an open wound, a reminder of how evil can move undetected when it wears the mask of normalcy. And maybe that's the most terrifying part. Ruth isn't remembered as a monster with wild eyes or blood-stained hands. She's remembered as a woman who could sit across from you at dinner, smile sweetly, and quietly decide your fate without you ever knowing. So the next time you hear of a widow draped in black, sobbing at a graveside, ask yourself, are those tears of grief? Or are they the crocodile tears of someone already calculating their next move? Because the killer widow taught us one thing: sometimes death doesn't come in the dark of night. Sometimes it comes wrapped in love, wearing a wedding ring. But stories like Ruth Holloway's never really die. They linger like smoke in the corners of history, resurfacing every time another suspicious Black Widow case hits the headlines. Detectives, historians, and true crime obsessives all circle back to her name, whispering of the woman who seemed untouchable. Because Ruth was not simply a killer, she was a template, a blueprint of manipulation, charm, and patience that other women, decades later, would eerily follow. Her legacy lived not in court records, because those were scarce and fragmented, but in the fears of the people who knew her. A niece once confided that as a child, she was terrified to sit at Ruth's table, terrified of the tea she poured. She saw she could smell something strange in the cup, though no one else seemed to notice. That memory haunted her well into adulthood. Another man, a family friend, recalled that Ruth had an unnerving way of looking at people, like she wasn't seeing them but weighing them, measuring their worth, calculating how long they might last. These weren't memories that faded with time. They were scars etched into those who encountered her. And then there was the folklore. In some towns she lived in, locals whispered that Ruth had made a pact with the devil, that no woman could outlive 8 husbands without supernatural help. Some swore they saw her slip into cemeteries long after midnight, not to mourn, but to whisper to the graves. Were these exaggerations likely? But the fact that people told them at all shows how deeply her shadow spread. She became less a person and more a myth. A cautionary tale mothers told their sons: be careful who you marry. Not every smile means safety. And yet, behind the legend, one terrifying truth remained. Ruth was flesh and blood, and she walked freely among others, her crimes unanswered. That is what chills us even now, because when we look back at Ruth Holloway, we're not just staring into the face of one woman's evil. We're staring into the reflection of a society that let her thrive. A society that dismissed suspicions, ignored patterns, and allowed wealth and charm to shield a predator. Her story forces us to confront a truth we'd rather not face: that the most dangerous killers are not the ones hiding in alleys. They are the ones sitting beside us at the dinner table, holding our hand, whispering promises of forever, and Ruth Holloway's forever always ended 6 feet deep. The curtain never truly closed on Ruth Holloway. Though her body was buried decades ago, her story feels unfinished, like a haunting that refuses to be silenced. Because when you peel back the layers, Ruth was never just one woman. She was the embodiment of something older, darker, and far more unsettling: the predator who hides in plain sight, who makes love her weapon, who turns devotion into a death sentence. Even today, newspapers still splash headlines about black widows who echo Ruth's methods, women who poison quietly, women who sign their lovers' life insurance policies with steady hands, women who wear their mourning veils like trophies. Each time one of these stories breaks, the past shakes awake, and Ruth's name drifts back into the conversation like a ghost refusing to rest. She may have been among the first to earn the title, but she was not the last. And here lies the warning, one final message from the killer widow's tale. Evil rarely looks like a monster with claws and fangs. More often it looks ordinary, polite, charming. It looks like someone you trust. That is what made Ruth so dangerous: her ability to convince the world she was fragile, heartbroken, even righteous. Yet beneath it all, she carried the patience of a hunter and the cold resolve of a mind untouched by conscience. The true crime world calls her a legend. Survivors of her orbit call her something else: a curse. Because if Ruth Holloway could operate for decades, undetected, untouched by the law, then who else walks among us now, unexposed? How many more coffins have been lowered into the earth under the guise of accident or illness, while a smile lingers at the widow's lips? Ruth left behind no confession, no journal, no grand admission of guilt. She took her secrets to the grave, where silence became her final alibi. But her story lives on as a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying killers are not the ones history records with mugshots and trials. Sometimes the most terrifying killers are the ones who slip through, leaving only whispers, empty coffins, and questions that will never be answered. 8 husbands. 8 deaths. No justice. Only a legacy that crawls like a shadow across time. And if Ruth Holloway teaches us anything, it is this: trust is a weapon. And once it's placed in the wrong hands, it can kill more efficiently than any blade. The killer widow is gone, but her lesson remains. But here's the unsettling part, the part no one wants to say out loud. What if Ruth Holloway wasn't unique? What if she wasn't a one of a kind monster, but simply the one who slipped through the cracks, while others, just as cunning, just as merciless, were better at covering their tracks? Think about it. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, deaths from mysterious illnesses were common. Autopsies were rare, coroners were undertrained. A woman could lace tea with arsenic and watch her husband waste away, and the neighbors would whisper only of God's will. How many more Ruths existed, hiding behind black veils and crocodile tears? The deeper you dig, the more chilling the parallels become. In Kentucky, there was Eliza Green, whose 3 husbands all died within 5 years. In Ohio, a woman named Clara Sims saw 4 fiancés perish before the wedding day. Their stories never made the headlines. They were whispered rumors, documented only in local archives, scraps of gossip, and faded obituaries. If Ruth Holloway's 8 dead husbands cast a long shadow, then these others form a silent army of names lost to time. And maybe that's the darkest truth of all. Ruth was caught only in hindsight, her legend pieced together from fragments. During her life, she was never punished, never even truly suspected by authorities. She died free, carrying her secrets to the grave. And yet, perhaps that's precisely why her story has survived. Because she represents the fear that justice is not always served, that some killers walk through life smiling, unbound, untouched, and perhaps even admired. When people talk about the killer widow today, they don't just see one woman, they see a reflection of society's blind spots. A warning of how charm blinds us, how wealth shields predators, and how even repeated patterns of death can be ignored when they arrive dressed in lace and civility. The story of Ruth Holloway is not merely history. It is a mirror, and when you peer into it, the question is no longer about her. It's about us. How many more sit across from us at dinner, their hands folded, their smiles warm, while in their hearts they carry the quiet patience of a killer? Because Ruth was proof of one thing: evil doesn't always announce itself. Sometimes it pours you a drink. The tale of Ruth Holloway does not end in the courtroom, nor in the grave, nor even in the whispers of neighbors who once pitied her. It ends here with you, because every story of a killer widow, every obituary written with suspicious timing, every headline about another tragic accident is really an invitation to open your eyes, to question, to never take a smile at face value. Ruth Holloway's true legacy is not her body count. It is the lesson her life teaches. Predators thrive in silence. They thrive in trust. They thrive in the gaps where no one dares to ask the obvious question. That is why she slipped away from justice, why she left a trail of coffins without consequence. She understood the oldest truth about human nature, that we believe what we want to believe, even when the evidence is staring us in the face. Think about it: 8 men, each swearing devotion to the same woman. 8 men, each convinced that she loved them back. 8 men who ignored the whispers, the rumors, the coincidences, and one by one, they were lowered into the ground while she stood above them, dressed in black, her lips trembling just enough to look like grief. That is Ruth's brilliance, and that is Ruth's curse. Because she forces us to admit the hardest truth of all: monsters do not always hide in shadows. Sometimes they stand at the altar. Sometimes they sit across from you at the dinner table. Sometimes they kiss you goodnight. The killer widow has long since turned to dust, but the fear she planted has not. It lingers, it waits, and perhaps it whispers even now, in the quiet doubt that creeps in when you realize that love can be a mask, that devotion can be a weapon, that the person you trust most could be the one writing your epitaph. So remember Ruth Holloway, not because of the men she buried, but because of the truth she revealed, that the most dangerous killers are not the ones with knives in alleys, but the ones who wait patiently, smile sweetly, and let you hand them the key to your life. And if that thought unsettles you, it should, because Ruth Holloway may be gone, but her kind never really disappears. Picture this: a quiet cemetery at dusk. The gravestones are worn, the names nearly erased by wind and time. Somewhere among them lies Ruth Holloway, the killer widow, buried in silence. No crowds, no mourners, no trace of the 8 men who trusted her with their lives. Just a cold, forgotten patch of earth. And yet her story refuses to stay buried. Because stories like hers never die. They whisper through history, carried on the wind like warnings no one wants to hear. They force us to look at the people closest to us and wonder, how well do we truly know anyone? Ruth's tale is more than crime. It is more than mystery. It is a reminder of the blindness built into human trust. How many of us would have seen what those men did not? How many of us would have noticed the pattern, the trail of graves? Or would we, too, have been blinded by her charm, her elegance, her carefully manufactured sorrow? Some say her ghost lingers not in the cemetery, but in the doubts she left behind. In every toxic relationship that feels too good to be true. In every smile that hides too much. In every sudden death that makes the neighbors whisper. Ruth Holloway is not just one woman. She is the embodiment of a timeless truth. The most dangerous predators are the ones we invite into our homes, our hearts, our beds. And that is why over a century later her name still chills us. Because deep down, we fear her story is not finished. That somewhere in some quiet town another widow sits in black lace, another man takes her hand, another obituary waits to be written. The killer widow reminds us that evil doesn't always look monstrous. Sometimes it looks like love. Sometimes it wears a wedding ring, and sometimes it smiles as it poisons your wine. So tonight, as you let this story settle in your mind, ask yourself one final question. If Ruth Holloway could fool 8 men, could she fool you too? And now we close the book. But not really, because stories like Ruth Holloway's never close. They linger, they follow, they echo long after the last word is spoken. 8 husbands, 8 coffins, 8 carefully rehearsed tears shed at gravesides. Yet Ruth herself never faced the punishment her victims deserved for her. No prison bars, no trial, no confession, just silence, and then the earth covering her secrets forever. But make no mistake, justice does not always wear a badge or sit behind a gavel. Sometimes justice is memory. Sometimes justice is fear. Ruth Holloway is dead, but her name endures, not as a forgotten widow, but as a warning etched into the dark corners of history. She became immortal in the only way a monster can, by teaching us that trust can kill, that love can deceive, that death can come wearing a wedding ring. So remember her, not because she was clever, not because she was ruthless, but because she showed us a truth that is hard to live with. Evil does not always come in the form of strangers. Sometimes it lies beside you. Sometimes it says, "I love you." Sometimes it waits patiently year after year until the day you are too weak, too blind, too trusting, and then it strikes. Ruth Holloway, the killer widow, is gone. But her shadow remains. It lives in the doubt you feel when someone's smile seems too perfect. It lives in the hesitation before you take that glass of wine. It lives in the whisper that says, "Watch closely, because the people closest to you can be the ones who end you." This is not just history. This is not just crime. This is a mirror. And when you look into it, you must decide, would you have seen her for what she was, or would you have been the next name carved in stone? The graveyard has its silence, but her story has no ending, because Ruth Holloway will always be here, in the space between love and fear, between devotion and death. A reminder that the most dangerous monster is the one you never see coming.